Thank you for joining us at ECFR. I'm very happy to be here with you and with our excellent panel for this event on the EU anti-coercion instrument and our question on how can Europe best protect itself from economic coercion. I'll quickly introduce to you our panelists who are with us today. I'm very happy and delighted to be joined by Colin Brown, who's head of unit at the European Commission for Legal Affairs and Dispute Settlement. Very happy also to be joined by Marie-Pierre Vedrenne, who's the vice chair of the International Trade Committee at the European Parliament, and who's thinking about these things from Brussels and Strasbourg, and Andreas who has joined us. And we're very thankful for joining on last minute. Who's a parliamentarian here in Berlin, MP at the Deutsche Bundestag in the Foreign Affairs Committee. Very happy to have all three of you. And our topic of economic coercion has been on the minds of many in Europe in recent months, years, and weeks. We're looking at a situation where powerful countries are increasingly reverting to economic blackmail to change European policies on a range of issues. We've seen China threaten Germany and Sweden with dire consequences, economic consequences of excluding Huawei from the 5G networks. Russia is looking into expanding its toolkit. And we've seen Turkey use economic threats as well. And under the Trump administration in particular, Europeans also had to fear tariffs and other procedures on because they were contemplating a certain tax policy or adopting different policy stances. And in a way, to us at ECFR, the Nord Stream 2 example, whatever one thinks of the project itself, shows that that sanctions can be a way, even under a really good partnership in transatlantic partnership, when there is disagreement between transatlantic partners, these sanctions do get employed, and Europeans, from that point of view, have to think about how to deal with that. Now, what we have done at ECFR was a task force project. We've brought together different high-level members or stakeholders on this topic of economic coercion in general. And one of the options we have analyzed was what we call the collective defense instrument. The idea behind it is that economic coercion, oftentimes when Europeans face it, it comes with quite a lot of speed, very speedily, in a way that where other instruments that we have may not suffice, and where Europeans are vulnerable, it gets employed very fast. Certain threat of tariffs and so or sanctions or so forth. What we also looked at is if you design economic coercion smartly from a third country perspective, then often then you try not to unite Europeans against you, but that it's what we find is that economic coercion is often divisive in the EU and makes decision making harder. And I've already mentioned it, the component of a threat or at least uncertainty oftentimes plays quite a big role, and this is difficult, especially for the EU as a trading bloc that relies on exporting a rules-based order in which Europeans can trade. And in this context, we thought and analyzed options. And one of them was this collective defense instrument, which would allow Europeans, through a framework regulation that would give the Commission the ability to react faster and collectively and take countermeasures in line with international law. We've analyzed that quite a bit, how that could potentially work, but we've also looked at challenges, and quite a few, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of them here, both during the panel discussion and the Q&A. I will now turn to the panel and turn to Colin from the Commission first, because I know that the public consultation on this instrument, on an anti-coercion instrument, as you guys are calling it, has just been launched actually today. So I would love to get your thoughts. What is the Commission's rationale for proposing this instrument? What are we thinking of? And why might it be necessary to have such an instrument? And I will just say to our audience, we'll be fairly quickly going to questions and answers. So please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box at any point, and we will come to that. We will receive that on the panel and come to those questions when they come in. But for now, please call in on, would be very interested in hearing about the rationale of the Commission for proposing such an instrument.
So thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you to ECFR for having organized this event and for having invited me to speak. I'm going to keep these opening remarks very short so that we can get into the discussion and the exchange with my fellow panelists and with the audience. So I'll just say a few words about the rationale behind the Commission's thinking. And you've already touched on them to a large extent in your introduction. I think it's clear from the Commission's perspective that we are living in an increasingly geoeconomic time. We see increasingly economic policies being used for political, strategic ends. And we have seen that, I think, in particularly as regards efforts by a number of non-EU states to force the European Union or to force EU member states into either adopting or from refraining from adopting particular policy measures. And I think it's the Commission's preference. I think it's obvious that it would be the Commission's preference. I think it's everybody's preference that where it's possible, we try to work through international cooperation. We, where necessary, negotiate international agreements to deal with international problems. But this is something which is becoming increasingly difficult and becomes increasingly difficult where this type of pressure is put on the EU institutions or member states and forces us into negotiation or cooperation from a position of weakness and makes it essentially takes away a reasonable basis for such cooperation. Now, I think we think that it's important to act not only because it is problematic to have this interference in the affairs of the EU or its member states, but because this has an impact on EU businesses. The closing of markets, the interference in investments, all of these have an impact on EU businesses. And that in turn has an impact on jobs and growth within the European Union. We therefore think that it's important that the EU finds a way to deter, and I put a strong emphasis on deter, and only if necessary, counteract this type of coercion. I would say that in the Commission's mind, and just to flag this, we view this separately from the question of response to extraterritorial sanctions. I think you're aware that the Commission has adopted a communication in January where it commits to further analyse and determine what types of actions are available as regards extraterritorial sanctions. But there is obviously, to an extent, an overlap between the two initiatives, and that's one of the things that we're interested in looking at in the public consultation. Now, the Commission wasn't alone in thinking this. These concerns were raised I think, first of all, by the European Parliament, in particular by Madame Vedrenne as rapporteur in a previous legislative file, and I think strongly supported by a large number of parliamentary groups. These are also concerns that a number of member states have as well. So the Commission is committed to study this and to bring forward a proposal. This is both in President von der Leyen's letter of intent to the Parliament and to the Council, and also in the Commission's work programme for 2021. Now, as you've said, we have just launched the public consultation. We didn't do that intentionally 2 hours before this event started, but the timing is quite felicitous. And we're interested in getting views on what European businesses are experiencing as coercion, so to give examples, so that we can better think about what are the triggers that any instrument would have. We're interested in finding more information about what form the deterrence or countermeasures should take. And we're interested, and this was the last point you were touching on, we're interested in how to design the framework for the adoption of such measures to ensure that they can be adopted expeditiously and to ensure that they can be effective. And that in the public consultation, which you can find quite easily, hopefully, on the Commission's website, is the type of information that we are looking for to allow us to make a proposal to the European Parliament and to the Council towards the end of this year. I'll stop there for just now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Colin. That's all very interesting, and you've mentioned the Parliament and particularly Ms. Vedrenne. So we want to turn to her, and I should just say, in the meantime, at this event, I should have said that right in the beginning, but our panelists know, of course, this is fully on the record, and we're recording this event. And Marie-Pierre, please, I want to go to you actually and ask both you and Andreas Nick after that. Do you think we are sufficiently strong for dealing with economic coercion, or do we need such an additional instrument? And the context is that sometimes we hear, that we have quite a few ways, of course, of dealing with unfair trade practices and similar things. So what's your view on where the gaps are, or if there are gaps? And clearly we've heard that I think there might be some gaps.
Thank you, Jonathan. Firstly, thank you for your invitation, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to discuss a new time with Colin Brown and the first time with Andreas Nick on this important topic. So for me, this instrument must be our top priority. Indeed, in terms of fighting back third country trade measures against the EU, because there is still a loophole. And in case of World Trade Organization dispute or dispute under our bilateral agreement, the revision of the enforcement regulation mentioned by Colin now offers the EU the possibility of taking effective countermeasures. However, we have no means of action against unilateral measures that are clearly illegal under international law. Like mentioned by Colin, I was the rapporteur on this file on enforcement regulation. And one of my objectives was to respond also to this situation in introducing preliminary or provisional measures when we are facing illegal measures without waiting for a World Trade Organization ruling. And the Commission and the Council were not in favor of introducing such measures in the enforcement regulation, but we obtained in the negotiation a joint declaration of the three institutions which come in to work by the end of this year on the proposal and on the new instrument to deter and counter coercive action. And this instrument will be the concretization of our proposal. And I think it's very important now to have this instrument. We need to defend our interests, and we need to have a new tool. And I do believe that it was because the European Parliament pushed on this way that we have this new proposal. And I think that one mistake will be to delay the adoption of such instruments because of the change in US administration. It is true that the President Biden is not Trump, but for instance, the extraterritorial effect of US sanctions will still be there. And in addition, other trading partners are following the same path in terms of unilateral measures. You already mentioned some example, and one clear example is China, who is also muscling its trade policy with the necessary tool to take unilateral measures. And in the context of the COVID crisis, China didn't hesitate to take illegal coercive measures against Australia, who was dissenting the Chinese policy and violating any rules under the trade bilateral agreement. So I think that there is a very good news that the EU, especially the Commission, seems to have taken seriously the global trading context. And I welcome the right intention of the Commission to have in the trade policy more assertive, as the trade policy clearly states. And I think that this new proposal is a very good way to deter and to counteract in case of unilateral and illegal measures. So now we have to work with all the stakeholders on this issue, of course, with the Commission, of course, with member states, with the European Parliament, and with members of businesses, because it's also with this tool the opportunity to build our open strategic autonomy. And it's very important to build, not to push this concept on the paper, to build the real autonomic strategy. So it's a good way, and I think now it's a good timing to really discuss on this event and in the next month.
Thanks very much, Marie-Pierre, for your points. And you did mention China, and of course on some people's mind is yesterday's EU sanctions and Chinese counter sanctions, which from our point of view don't look just reciprocal, but actually asymmetrical. But they are not economic in terms of what we're. I mean, they are economic for the people and entities concerned, possibly, but it may be the fact that China is willing to asymmetrically counteract such measures does feel to Europeans like somewhat shows a willingness to go further than we would like, probably. Let's see what it sounds like or looks like from Berlin. Andreas, Nick, also the question to you: do you think, from a parliamentarian's point of view, albeit a different parliament, but still, do you think are there gaps and vulnerabilities, and is this an anti-coercion instrument a good way of addressing and closing the gaps?
Yes, thank you very much for having me on this. I think no question, as Europeans, we have been exposed to increasing attempts of economic coercion. I have referred to that at some point also as the privatization of foreign policy, where decisions that have traditionally been made by governments or supranational bodies like the EU are now basically through external coercion put into the decision-making of individual companies and managers, making these decisions under totally different arguments and priorities. That is something that is totally unacceptable. The second observation I think that I would make is that we have seen that instruments like the EU blocking statute or like the Instex mechanism have not really fulfilled their purpose for a number of reasons. So I think we need to reassess our toolkit in this regard. But I would always tend to follow the guiding principle: if you can't solve a problem, try to enlarge the context. I tend to look at this whole subject in terms of three priorities. The legal set of instruments and deterrence toolkit, I think, is only the third element of this strategy. I think the first priority that I see is we need to be able and willing to strengthen European resilience against these external measures. I think we have been, from my perspective, overly reluctant so far to even apply instruments that we already have at hand, because it is somewhat against our fundamental philosophy of free and open markets and cooperation in international affairs. I think we could have been much more rigid on a number of examples. For example, the SWIFT case. But the second priority, I think, if we want to be more resilient, we need to very carefully assess where our vulnerabilities are in terms of economic and technological asymmetries. So I would see this as a key priority also, to have a medium to long-term strategy to reduce those asymmetries, to reduce vulnerabilities. I think as part of the COVID crisis, we've learned of a few additional ones. When I look at the vaccination issue that keeps us also busy on the national parliaments level at the moment. And we have to fully grasp the consequences that as we move into a world that Mark Leonard once has described as a world of connectivity wars, economic interdependencies can be exploited and will be exploited by others, and we need to prepare for that by building resilience, by reducing this asymmetry. The more so as if those asymmetries are no longer, or economic interdependencies, which we've long almost universally thought are a good idea in terms of reducing tensions and fostering cooperation between states, if these interdependencies are no longer embedded in the framework of a rules-based international order that contains potential use and abuse of these asymmetries. So political risk has become more prevalent and has become probably more intolerable. And then that is then where we come, I think, to the third set of priorities, and where I said as a deterrence element, as a instrument of last resort, we also need to be able to have a toolkit of political and legal countermeasures. I think the first step, from my perspective, would be for the EU Commission to provide a regular assessment of market distortions caused by extraterritorial sanctions to make this transparent. This gives us also a better view of the vulnerabilities, and then also to consider very carefully how we could react specifically in those situations. But being a politician, I would also always say, unless we are in a framework where we are much more willing to counter resilience and to reduce asymmetries, a toolkit that may not be people may not be willing to use, or maybe shy away from using because they fear countermeasures, will not be as effective as it could be when it's backed up by a level of resilience and strategic autonomy that needs to be there as a more fundamental aspect. I leave it with that and cover the remainder in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andreas Nick from Berlin, and very, very clear your points on resilience and the importance of reducing asymmetries and thinking about our own sort of strength as well, and as part of the strategy. And also a special thanks for you for coming in on very short notice. Sven Simon had another very important appointment and couldn't make it. So great to have you. And so now we'll turn to questions and answers, and there's been quite a few that have already come in. Let me pick one that's certainly a point that we have to bring up, and that is something that many worry about when they think about another instrument or an instrument. Is there a danger of us becoming protectionist? And I'll read one question here. The question is: there's no question that other countries engage in economic coercion, but the question is, what's an effective way to make them change? And what are the proposed countermeasures? More concretely, can that work? And for example, if we're thinking tariffs, then counter tariffs, then in examples from the past where the EU has imposed retaliation in the form of tariffs, and did the other side really change behavior? That's one question. I think that's on our mind, and or that's on many people's minds. And I'll take another one, maybe on the rationale between separating pressure from extraterritorial sanctions and other economic pressures. I think maybe I'll bundle these two. Why view them as separate? Is someone asking in our audience? So I might go to Colin first with these questions. But the bigger question of what's the right balance? I think someone we spoke to recently said we have a dilemma. We need to be prepared and be able to shield ourselves from economic coercion, but openness and non-protectionism are key for Europe and European economies. So what's the right balance? Maybe to Colin first with this question and the sanctions question.
Yeah. So on the first question, I mean, I think first of all we should be clear that this is not about protectionism. This is about making sure that EU exports or EU investments, EU business activities abroad are not unfairly or legally impacted. So we're not talking about protecting any domestic industry. We're talking about making sure markets are kept open as they should be. And the balance is something indeed that has to be carefully thought out. And I'm not going to give a magic prescription or description of what that will be just now. That's part of what the public consultation, of course, is about. But I think what we will be looking at is trying to match up the types of activities that we identify that amount to coercion, and try to match them up with the most appropriate measures that respond to that. And I think we would want to have, and this is going to be one of the challenges in design, we would want to have a certain amount of flexibility to be able to respond to different situations. But we will need to find a way to provide a framework in which that flexibility operates to the satisfaction of the legislators as well. And that ensures, as you rightly said, Mr. Nick also talked about the importance of maintaining an open approach. On the question of extraterritorial sanctions, this is not directly covered because the original idea behind this is the types of situations where coercion is used to force a change in government policy. You gave some examples at the beginning, Jonathan, but these were the types of ideas that were at the genesis of this initiative. Our view is that extraterritorial sanctions do not always have this element of seeking to coerce government policy, and certainly not in the same way of some of the actions that we're looking at. Some do, some don't. So I think from our perspective, extraterritorial sanctions don't fit squarely in what we are working on with this initiative. That said, as I noted, there are questions in the public consultation on the link between the two. That is something that we want to reflect further together with the colleagues in other parts of the Commission, and I presume the same in the member states or the Parliament who are thinking about those issues. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Marie-Pierre, on the question, on both questions really, but I know the political question of this instrument, of course, is the question: do we create too many instruments and are not enough, not cautious enough to protect our openness?
Thank you, Jonathan. Of course, it's very important to stay open, but it's also very important to defend with efficiently our interests and our ambition. It's why, for me, it's very important to have a real toolbox with this new instrument. And in fact, to have a new tool with the real willingness to use this new tool. So for me, it's very important to work on this instrument, on the scope, on its implication, and on its functioning. On the scope, of course, we have to find the right balance. And so which coercive measures should be taken? And maybe I not totally agree with Colin. I would say that we should primarily be able to respond to manifest illegal and unilateral measures, which fall out of the scope of the World Trade Organization. It's very important to have this complete scope. The EU is at the front of defending multilateralism and the World Trade Organization. However, the EU cannot be always a naive partner. And extraterritoriality effect of third country sanction is nothing but coercion for our European interests. This is why I strongly believe that this instrument should be a way to reform the blocking statute and to give us a strong power to reply to illicit extraterritorial effect of first country concern. And second, we need to see what will be the scope of countermeasure. And as fought for in enforcement regulation revision, we should be able to impose countermeasure in all the fields, good public procurement, but also services and intellectual property rights. Because services and RPR are a growing part of our trade relation, especially with the COVID crisis. So the EU cannot be limited in imposing countermeasure. We need to be credible. And third, we have to evaluate how this instrument will work concretely, because it's very important to have proportionality of the measure and consulting all the stakeholders. And I think it's very important to involve the European Parliament also in the process, and of course the member states. But we need real effect, because if it's not efficient, it will not be a useful instrument. So this is for me the overview of this new instrument, and to find a right balance between open, sustainable, and assertive, to be coherent with the new trade policy review.
Thank you very much, Marie-Pierre. And we have, I think this entire question has triggered quite a few others. So really good to see all these questions coming in. We will try to get to all of them. I'll give the floor to Andreas, Nick, and your thinking on this political question of the right balance between openness and preparedness, and what you think, what should Europe's line be on that?
I think, of course, we should not use this as a pretext for measures that are predominantly of a protectionist nature, but I don't necessarily see that danger as developed. If I look at what are issues that we will have to deal with, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of what I see is the attempt to privatize political choices to businesses and their managers. And we will have to ask ourselves the question if it's more costly for European companies and their managers to not comply with European regulations, but will very willingly comply with foreign non-European regulations or demands, then we have an issue. And I think we have so far been maybe a bit too reluctant to exercise pressure on certain businesses ourselves. If I look at regulated industries, financial services industry, a lot of those companies have been affected by US unilateral sanctions mainly because of the question of the US dollar and access to the US financial markets. These are regulated industries. Managers of these companies have to withstand a test of reliability to be licensed to be a manager of a regulated banking business, for example, in the European Union. We have been very reluctant so far, very shy to tell some of these people, if you are over-complying with sanctions from outside the EU, thereby counteracting EU policies, we may revoke your license. That is something that we have been very reluctant to do so, and we may have to reconsider that. Clearly, we have to see that other countries, in exerting pressure on decision makers in business here, use the weight of the value of access to their national markets. We, as the European Union, represent one of the biggest and most attractive consumer markets in the world, still for the next 15 to 20 years. We are so far very shy to use this as a political instrument. We should maybe doing more so, for example, in international trade treaties also, whether it's with Mercosur or with Africa, but using that also more as a policy instrument. And we see in a number of issues that while we are very rigidly adhering to liberal market orthodoxy, some of the most proverbial capitalist countries, whether it's United Kingdom or the United States, are not shying away from using state power in influencing certain decisions. If I look at the issue of vaccination issue again, where we may have exposed ourselves to more risks than was responsible in this whole context. So looking forward, I think the EU is not a strong political power, it's not a military power, but it has a huge economic power in controlling access to one of the most attractive consumer markets in the world. And if we want, we can be a very powerful norms and standard setter, as we have seen with the data protection directive, which most of Silicon Valley has accepted as a global gold standard. So I think using our market access and regulatory power more assertively is something that we should really consider for the way going forward. And we may have a time window of 10, 15 years still to do so, but this is our chance to shape the global arena.
Thanks, Andreas. Nick. And let me, I'll probably take you first in the next round. There's a bunch of questions that have come in, and I'll try to bundle them and ask you to also be concise in replying to several of them at the same time, just so we can make it through quite a few of them. One question or several questions have asked, have picked up on this idea. Andreas Nick has mentioned privatization of the geopolitics or of politics and businesses stuck in between. So one question, for instance, is why are we going in the Commission proposal and what's out for now in the communication? Why are we thinking mostly of states and state sovereignty, and should we not think of the damage done to business and approach it from that way? That's one question. And another one is, do we not need public compensation, given that that the public sectors are causing this and are responsible for economic coercion? We also have a question on a big question on the whole, and I'll probably look at Colin for this question. The big question of how does this interact with the WTO dispute settlement? How international law? And the question, is it not in our best interest, as someone in the audience put it, to bolster the rules-based order rather than circumvent it? Now, that's the question. That's how it's being put. Or is there? I would add, is there a way of having such an instrument and bolster the rules-based order through the instrument rather than circumventing it? What are your views on that? And I'll start with Andreas Nick on this question. I'll add one last one, and that's current context EU-China. How concretely would you say would it help reduce asymmetries in the trade skirmishes or trade skirmishes we can expect. That's what someone is asking if we had such an instrument. But Andreas, Nick, I'll let you go first on these questions, business rather than states. That's my very short way of putting it in concise terms, the whole question of WTO, international law and so forth, and EU-China context.
Okay, I'll pick a few, and maybe the two other panelists can take care of those which I've left out as well. I don't see this as something that is simply antagonizing politics and business or governments and business. I think we will have to see that global business operate in also in competing regulatory environments. They operate in alternative market access scenarios, and they make their own decisions based on their own assessment of risk and potential gain. I think to a certain extent it would be naive in a world that is moving toward, in very large parts, of a state capitalism, and for the first time maybe in history, to state capitalism that seems to be competitive in certain aspects, that we should restrain ourselves from looking at the appropriate mix between public policy and business decisions. And I think there are areas where global business can be very effective in helping to achieve certain policy objectives. When we talk about adherence to human rights standards, to minimum labor standards, to minimum environmental standards across the value chain, I'm convinced that it's much better to get global businesses on board in trying to ensure that these compliance standards are met on a global basis in their supply chains than trying to do that by government-to-government agreements. I'm pretty sure that the big manufacturers or distributors, for example, of textile products, will have a much better leverage on securing minimum labor safety and environmental standards in Bangladesh or other places than we would have on a government-to-government basis. So I think it's not something where we should see that in as politics and business as antagonizing, but in defining the right framework where we can work hand in hand in achieving better objectives. And we should not be naive in the way we deal with that, but I think we should be also, as regulators and politicians, also reliable partners to our own business. But we should not be naive in exposing them freely to the pressures and illegitimate coercions by others in this world. That would be, I think, also a naive approach to do so. And I fear I have to run in a few minutes, so I may excuse myself for the last 10 minutes or so of this conversation, but probably I'll stop here.
Thanks a lot. And again, thank you for joining on such short notice. We
Welcome.
Absolutely understand you didn't necessarily plan for being there for the whole hour. So we're really happy that you could join. Let me go to Marie-Pierre next, and then we'll come to Colin. Marie-Pierre, and I'll add just because we don't have enough questions yet. I'll just ask. Add one question or two, and actually several questions have asked about the institutional setup, and we'll go to Colin as well on that. But where will this sit? How would it work concretely using the instrument for the EU? And also a question: would it not be a good idea to have a place at the top of EU institutions to monitor coercive actions? I think I'm immediately thinking of the resilience office idea that we have in our paper, where you would have a place in the EU analyzing what sort of coercive actions are taking place, and also possibly coordinating the response between different instruments and countermeasures that one would have that the EU would have at its disposal. So add this institutional question to the entire question of international law, WTO, EU, China, and this question of the focus on state sovereignty versus possibly business damage. Marie-Pierre, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think, of course, it's very important to work with all the stakeholders and all the sector. And maybe it's a good timing also to strengthen the cooperation with Denis Bretonnet, which is the new Chief Trade Investment Officer. I think it's a very good interlocutor. And for me, it was always possible to join Denis Bretonnet and to work with him on all issues and with all the team of the DigiTrade. Of course, it's very important to work with our stakeholders, with our SMEs, with our enterprise, because the principal effect is on the business. So it's very important because we know, for example, if we have a focus, for example, on the Airbus Boeing case, the effects are not only on aeronautic sector, but with all the sector. So it's very important to link all the stakeholder on all the issue. Maybe just a precision, because when we have discussion on the trilogue during the negotiation on enforcement regulation and with the proposal on the provisional measure, our idea was always to, of course, to have the possibility to introduce countermeasure at the beginning of the process, but also in the meantime, and at the same time, introduce a panel discussion on the World Trade Organization. For us and for the European Parliament, of course, it's very important to define a rule-based system. So, but like I mentioned, in this case and in this situation, our partner doesn't respect the international law. So for us, it's very important to respect World Trade Organization and to respect World Trade international law. So it's very important to have the double effect in the same time, because I think that now without the ability to do something, it's not more possible. So it's very important to be in the conformity and in compliance with international law. But if we have discussion with all businesses and with all European interests in all the countries, it's very important to demonstrate that the EU is no more naive, but of course, but have the ability to really react. So it's why for me, it's very important to have this possibility in the new tool.
Thanks a lot. And now over to Colin with this question as well, because my understanding is that the Commission isn't proposing something from its own perspective that would be contrary to international law. And so that question, and I'll just remind you of the other issues that were raised on this bulk of questions: WTO dispute settlement. How does it fit in with other instruments? And then something that has just been raised again, is our experience that we can actually affect behavioral change from the other side through such countermeasures? Or I would add the deterrent effect of just having an instrument. And the other questions might be still on your mind, but we'll do a final round after this. I'll just give you the floor now, Colin.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to everybody for the questions. And just to be clear, from the Commission side, because we're starting the public consultation, all of this process is lying out in front of us. So there will be plenty of opportunities to ask questions, to have these types of exchanges, and our website has information about that. So a few points on conformity with international law. I mean, it is not the European Union that is contemplating circumventing international law. It is the other way around. It is by taking coercive measures, as Marie-Pierre Vedrenne put it, by taking coercive measures, the non-EU country is stepping outside international law. And international law in those circumstances provides for the possibility of countermeasures. And these countermeasures are intended, if you want, to rebalance the equilibrium under international law. So it is not, and I repeat, it's not the Union that is in this initiative contemplating circumventing. It is reacting to circumvention by a third country, and the whole logic behind countermeasures, and you can find this if you read the International Court of Justice decisions, the whole logic of countermeasures is to induce compliance on the other side. So the logic is that by applying countermeasures, the other side desists from the action that they were taking. The concrete examples that we see of this over the last number of years have been in the World Trade Organization, where, as you know, if a case has been litigated and if there is still not compliance, then it is possible to impose countermeasures in order to bring about that compliance. And we've seen lots of examples of, first, the deterrence being sufficient, and secondly, if the countermeasures are applied, then getting to the point of compliance. And I think we should be clear as well that we see this as a breach of, and what we're focusing on is a breach of public international law. We don't, the issues that the way we conceive of this is not as a breach of WTO law. WTO law has its mechanisms to deal with breaches of WTO law, but as a breach of public international law, separate from WTO law. So we are in this, the general sphere of operation of public international law, in which WTO law is a part. So that's how we see this internationally. The point was also raised of the impact on business. Now our questionnaire, our public consultation is just out. I'm not expecting people to have read it. It's not that exciting, but I do encourage people to read it. But it asks a number of questions, precisely trying to identify the impact on businesses. So that's something that we're interested in getting information about and understanding better. I should also say that if there are confidentiality concerns, there are indications in the questionnaire about how to handle those confidentiality concerns. We will find a means to handle that. But there are also questions in the questionnaire precisely around issues around compensation or some type of protection for business. So we're interested also in getting views on that as an idea, which of course doesn't solve the problem of the breach, the original breach of public international law, to which we are responding to. Maybe I stop there, given we've only got a few minutes left, and I'm happy if there are other points you want to take up.
Yes, thanks a lot. There is I'll go back one more time to Marie-Pierre with and I'll ask you to just take 2 minutes or so that Colin will also have 2 more minutes. One other question that we haven't mentioned yet is solidarity related. Is our unity, EU unity, strong enough for such an instrument? So I'll throw that at you, that question, and but also we still have the institutional question open, I believe, to some degree. Where will it sit, and this sort of resilience office idea, EU institution, and several others but many. I'll have one more for Colin on the next round, but Marie-Pierre for now.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, in fact, the solidarity in the united Europe, it's always a difficult question and a difficult issue, but we have united markets, so we need to be more united politically to defend globally our interests. But of course, each country defends its own interests. But with this context and with this crisis, but also with other cases, we've shown that if we are not able to defend the global interest of the European Union, in fact, we defend not the German interest, the French interest, the Spanish interest, because we are completely linked. But we know that, for example, when we have discussion on enforcement regulation, previously, we know that on the council side, it was very difficult for the German presidency to have unity. It's why I think that it's more easy in the European Parliament to work on this issue and to work with the European Commission. And for example, on enforcement, it was very useful to work with the Commission. And of course, with this new interest, with this new tool, I think we have a lot of discussion on the council side. But it's very important to move forward for all our markets and for all our businesses. So sometimes I think it's really important to be pragmatic and to move forward. So I think with this instrument, we need to be ambitious, but also pragmatic.
Thank you. And the last words will be Colin's. Just as a reminder, we have this institutional question, how it will work, but also a few others, current context, EU-China, but also let me just ask one question that I haven't been able to bring up yet. How will the Commission weigh using this instrument, basically, or as the member in the audience was saying, this sort of nuclear option in quotes, against the benefits of using the instrument against possible retaliation that one could possibly expect. And I think I'll give you the floor immediately before throwing more questions at you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So on the institutional issue, I think from our perspective, this is reasonably clear, at least in terms of the instrument that we have in mind, in the sense that we are focusing on coercive measures which take the form of actions on trade or investment. And when we think about deterrence and possible countermeasures, again, we are thinking largely about trade investment. We're not ruling anything out at this moment in time, but this is what largely we're thinking of. And so this puts us fairly and squarely in the EU's exclusive competence for common commercial policy. And according to the treaty, that gives us certain formats within which to work. So we will need a framework regulation, like the enforcement regulation. We will need to pick a menu of ways to allow the Commission to act quickly. So delegated acts, implementing acts, there are different things to consider, but these are the main options. I don't think I can speculate on whether there would be any type of reorganization within the Commission to create some type of specific office or body that would be monitoring these more general coercive issues. As you can perfectly well imagine, there are many similar demands for specific organizations or specific bodies, and that is something that the overall management of the Commission has to keep in mind. In terms of weighing of the use of this, I mean, this is something, and there are questions in the public questionnaire on this. This is something that needs to be carefully thought about. How does one move from the identification of a coercive action through actions aimed at trying to deter to possible countermeasures? What are the different options there? There will be, I saw there was a question about this, it would be the Commission's intention that there would be consultation of stakeholders somewhere in that process, similar to what there already is foreseen in the enforcement regulation. So there will have to be a gradation, but we have to take into account that the primary objective is to deter, and deterrence requires being able to act quickly and with some, potentially with some force. So we need to think about what is the best framework for that. Stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much to Marie-Pierre Vedrenne, to Colin Brown, also to Andreas Nick, who's already left us. We didn't get to each and every question for enough time to answer it fully and comprehensively, and I'm sure there are more questions, but this is just the start, in any case, of the Commission's public consultation. So we'll be watching that and working on these topics as well at ECFR. Thank you very much to the panelists, to the audience, and good luck with everything. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.